us were sitting at a picnic table, and we sat there and we said, why the hell aren't there more women? And so out of that, WTF was born.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the third installment of our Women's Tech Forum virtual masterclass series. Thanks for also bearing with us as we got a little late start there. We were dealing with some technical difficulties, so thanks for bearing with us there. My name is Nadia Tafaha, and I'm coming to you live from my childhood bedroom in central Pennsylvania. No matter where you all are located right now in the world, I just want to let you know I'm sending you good vibes your way. I hope everyone has been staying safe and healthy. I also want to give a special shout out to our co-founder, Susie Gleason, whose birthday it is today. So happy birthday, Susie. This year has been such a strange and difficult time for us in more ways than just one. I remember at the beginning of the year getting together with our WTF board and talking about our goals and vision for the year, and we simply couldn't have predicted where we are now. But oftentimes in these challenging and difficult times, there can be a silver lining. And in that case, it's been getting the chance to connect with all of you in a different way. While we miss seeing all of your faces and getting together in person at our events, we've just been blown away by your responses to our first two virtual master classes. You all have just brought such a level of enthusiasm, engagement, asking questions, and it's just been awesome to see that, and it's a reminder of why we're doing this in the first place. I invite you to please bring that same level of engagement and curiosity on today's session by leveraging the chat feature on the right-hand side, and you can also ask a question using the Q&A button as well. Today's masterclass is on creating successful diversity and inclusion programs and is curated by the wonderful Susanne Tedrick, who's a fellow woman in tech and an esteemed author of the book, Women of Color in Tech. This session is brought to you by Digital Realty. This is such a timely topic with the issue of systemic racism coming to the forefront of our national discourse and the momentum of the Black Lives Movement taking a global stage. I personally am looking forward to absorbing as much as possible from this session and doing my part in creating a more inclusive environment within our industry, and I really hope all of you take away something from this too. So with that, I'd like to introduce Kathy Smith from Digital Realty, who will say a few words and introduce our speakers. Kathy, take it away.
Great, thank you, Nadia, and thank you, WTF, for creating this masterclass series and for inviting me and Digital Realty to introduce this session. I, like WTF, here at Digital, we have a Women's Leadership Forum, which has a very similar purpose to inspire, engage, and educate in order to promote an inclusive environment. About 3 years ago, at an all-hands meeting, the Women's Leadership Forum was born. It was really out of a question that came at our quarterly all-hands meeting, which led to a conversation between Susie Gleason, WTF co-founder, and happy birthday, by the way, and digital colleague of myself. And we just started having a conversation, which led to further conversations that resulted in the creation of a global forum, which is now 400 women strong. Getting involved in inclusion and diversity can feel daunting and overwhelming. But for me, in the most simplest terms, it really starts with raising your hand, taking the initiative, and starting the conversation. This is one of the main reasons, and many others, that I am truly excited about today's session, as here at Digital, our inclusion and diversity journey will continue to evolve. Before I turn this over to Susanne Tedrick, who was introduced earlier by Nadia, I have the pleasure of introducing two women that Susanne will be speaking with during her session. Dr. Marcelle Davis is a diversity and inclusion leader who assists clients in evaluating business landscapes and implementing projects and policies to integrate inclusion and business practices. Additionally, she is experienced in providing organizational leaders with the tools and strategies to equip them to move from the ideation of inclusion to the integration of it. She has published 2 articles in the Journal of Practical Consulting, a third in the Journal of Business Diversity titled Global Leadership, and a book titled Measuring Inclusion Leadership with Grace. Theresa Worthy will also join, and she is a best-selling author, remarkable award-winning motivational speaker, and a thought leader. With enthusiasm and energy, Theresa tells stories that connect to humanity and stimulate innovation. Being an African American keynote speaker, Theresa strategically uses stories on diversity to demonstrate how to move beyond the tolerance to embrace differences, improve relations with the surrounding community, and push the boundaries of creativity with an allure that transcends barriers of culture, age, and occupation. With all of that and much enthusiasm, I'd like to turn this over to the main event and start the conversation. Thank you so much, and now over to you, Susanne.
Kathy, thank you so much for the warm introductions, and thank you so much to Women's Tech Forum for allowing us to have this really important conversation. And we hope that you get a lot out of today's session. We hope that you'll get a lot of information, but as well as tangible takeaways on how to create unique and successful diversity and inclusion programs within your organization, or perhaps further refining your efforts if you've already started on that path. Next slide, please. Our objectives for today's discussion will be to give you a better understanding of why organizations in any industry and of all sizes need to have diversity and inclusion. We will talk about what are the practical, tangible steps that organizations can take towards building a diversity and inclusion initiative. And finally, we'll talk about how we should be measuring the program's effectiveness and how do we make sure that we're holding our leadership accountable for that. Next slide, please. For our agenda, we'll start by defining what diversity and inclusion is and make clear why organizations should treat diversity and inclusion as a business imperative. We'll then dive into our roundtable discussion, where we'll focus on 5 key areas. We'll talk about the key groundwork organizations should undertake and the common challenges that are faced when cultivating these initiatives. We'll talk about mentoring and how that can be part of a great D&I program, as well as advice for small to mid-sized organizations that may have resource constraints. And then finally, the key indicators to help indicate whether or not a program is being effective. Next slide, please. So let's start this discussion by defining what exactly is diversity and inclusion. Sometimes these terms are used interchangeably, but they do mean 2 very distinct and separate things. Diversity is any dimension that can be measured to differentiate one group or another. And we can think about this in terms of race, ethnicity, and sex. But we can also include age, sexual orientation, class, disability, and nationality, amongst other factors. And when we talk about diversity, it isn't a tolerance of what our differences are, where your difference is accepted out of a sense of obligation, but rather it's a genuine appreciation of the differences that we have and what we bring to the table. And inclusion takes that a step further. It's where every individual feels that their needs are being met so that they are achieving their fullest potential within the organization. They feel engaged. They have a full sense of full authority of how best to do their jobs and meaningfully contributing to the success of their organizations, versus feeling tokenized or feeling like they're being inserted into positions for optics or because the powers that be or feel forced in order to do so. Next slide, please. I included this diagram to illustrate what inclusion looks like a little bit further. So on the left of this diagram, we see what exclusion and segregation look like, where diverse communities are either completely shut out or left out, or they're given a separated environment from our larger groups. Then there's integration, where diverse communities may be included in a group, but they are placed within their own circles within the larger circle. Now, these diverse communities may be included, but only on the premise that they conform to the larger group. People within these groups may have a sense of feeling like they don't belong, even though theoretically they are part of the larger group. With inclusion, though, everyone is occupying the same space with no further boundaries. Everyone is able to bring their full and best selves to the group. And ideally, this is what we'd like to strive for when creating these programs. Next slide, please. So in my humble opinion, having a D&I initiative in your organization really shouldn't be looked at as a nice to have. For most businesses, it is a business imperative for the longer term health and growth of your company, as well as the competitiveness and success. It's just something that if you're trying to vie for people, resources, money, whatever the case may be, having a diverse team and inclusive culture will be important to that end. And it's because diverse and inclusive teams yield better results. They're better at problem solving together. They're better at decision making together. And they have more creativity because we have a variety of experiences and perspectives at the table. And many studies have been done from the likes of McKinsey, Deloitte, and Glassdoor on the tangible bottom line results that D&I brings to an organization. And just to highlight a few that are on the slide, companies with D&I initiatives are twice as likely to meet or exceed their financial targets. They're 3 times as likely to have high-performing teams. They're 6 times as likely to be considered innovative and agile, and 8 times as likely to achieve or exceed their business outcomes. And when it comes to talent and finding top talent, especially amongst the millennials, having diverse and inclusive environments is key. According to Glassdoor, 67% of job seekers reported that having a diverse environment was a key factor in their decision to working with an employer. Now that we've set the groundwork for all of that, let's go ahead and start with our roundtable discussion. Next slide, please. And I'm really excited to be here today with Dr. Marcelle Davis and Theresa Worthy, 2 very respected D&I professionals. So ladies, thank you again for joining this conversation and this discussion. And let's go ahead and get started. So obviously, there's a strong desire to not only get diversity and inclusion initiatives off the ground, but to do it in a way that is thoughtful and meaningful. So Dr. Davis, I'll start with you. At a very high level, what kind of preliminary work or due diligence should an organization undertake when starting a D&I program?
Susanne, thank you for that question. And first, let me say I'm honored to be here with you and the rest of the team today. I think this message is so incredibly important and so timely. D&I is typically a strategic seat at the table, and I think it's evolved in the last 56 years, right, since the Civil Rights Act was signed into law in 1964. But truly, it's not as simple as just standing a program up, right? I think first the organization needs to understand what their needs are before developing a D&I program. And so what this means is they should take a deep look at their employee life cycle and then determine what the candidate or employee experience is within each part of that cycle. So when I talk about the candidate experience, I'm actually referring to applicants who apply to the organization, and leaders should gather information specific to this stage. For example, where are the candidates being recruited from? Who recruits them? Who interviews them? What does that interview slate look like? This is important even if they don't get a job offer, because it's important to determine whether both minorities and non-minority candidates are having a similar experience. But when it comes to the life cycle of the internal employee, we're talking about hiring, developing, retention, termination, or even exit. And it's critical to capture data that reports on the representation of employees of color as well as women. And I would even go as far as breaking that data down to reflect protected classes. This way, you'd be able to get a detailed look across all of our communities within the organization.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Davis. Theresa, was there anything that you wanted to add to this question?
Well, thank you so much. And I'm too very honored to be here. And I'd like to thank everyone who's joined us. When I think about preliminary work to begin a diversity and inclusion program, the first thought that comes to mind is that with the exception of a sole proprietorship, every organization has diversity because as human beings, we're like diamonds with multiple facets that make us who we are. And some of those differences, if you will, are age, generational issues, or experiences, whether or not we're a veteran, whether or not we're a parent. And as mentioned earlier, race and gender, those are pretty obvious in most cases. But there's a broad spectrum of diversity, just like there's a broad spectrum of people in the world. So there's no issue where diversity is concerned. All organizations have them, unless there's just one employee. It's the inclusion, because diversity does not mean inclusion, as you showed in your slides, nor does it guarantee inclusion. So one of the first things that I believe an organization who is ready, who has made a decision to create an inclusive climate in the workplace, the first thing to do is to clearly define the goals of that organization and then align the contributions of each employee in that organization toward achieving those goals. And then the second thing is to assess the inclusion climate that's currently there. And by this I mean determining whether or not there are groups that are overrepresented or underrepresented. Both indicate a lack of inclusion. The third thing to do is to put HR practices into effect once you've decided that, hey, we don't have inclusion here. We need to, if we're going to do this, let's do this. So HR practices should be clearly thought out so that hiring can be fair, recruiting can be fair, and that based on a set out standards, you're looking for employees who are qualified, who have potential, and who are competent for the job that you're hiring for. And then look at that across the board, fairly for everyone. The next thing to do is to develop employee insight, or to develop an understanding for the people who work there. And my motto always is, if you can't figure out how to get to know people, tell them a story. We're all storytellers, natural storytellers. We tell stories when we sleep. We call them dreams. So just beginning, this begins with leadership by simply saying good morning to people. And then maybe you can start with something as simple as, what did you have for breakfast this morning? And who knows where that conversation can lead. But at the end of it, both people will have gained information about each other, and they make a connection. And once these connections are made all through the organization, even if they're small connections, then leadership should work toward establishing an atmosphere of comfort so that employees feel safe expressing how they feel or expressing who they are. So like someone said before, they can bring their true and authentic, beautiful diamond selves into the workplace every day without feeling like, they looked at me funny because of, whatever. And then the last thing is to, once they form this connection, is to make sure that leaders model the behaviors. That means whatever is expected from this whole inclusion program, leaders model it. That means leaders speak to people. Leaders are fair in their comments and treatments and evaluations of their team members or whatever. They make sure that they're welcoming, because that's the bottom line for inclusion, making everyone feel valued, making everyone feel welcome, making everyone feel as if they belong. Someone once said that diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. And who doesn't like to dance? I know I do.
I definitely do as well. So no, you're spot on, and thank you both for those insights. And and especially just leaders really taking the charge in kind of setting the tone and the culture. One of the things that I definitely bring up to everyone, regardless of where they are in the organization, definitely learning to become a better ally, and understanding what allyship is, understanding, listening to communities of color or other communities, to really just understand. Once you have a better understanding, once you know kind of the plight that people face and the things that they have to go through each day, I feel like that informs you being a better advocate to people. You're more cognizant of what is going on. Some resources that I've found helpful are a guide to allyship, which is like an online guide about what allyship looks like, and training you, as well as better allies, everyday actions to create engaging workplaces. So I definitely think that just training yourself on how to listen with empathy really helps set the tone for the initiatives that you plan on having moving forward. Um, but yeah, thank you so much for those insights. So now let's go into our next portion, which is talking about challenges specifically. So on average, U.S. businesses spend approximately $1 million in creating and implementing D&I solutions. But many companies have reported that their efforts have stalled, they actually might have had negative effects, or they're just disappointed that the investment that they're making is not yielding the results that they would like to see. Theresa, what do you think has been, I guess, the biggest challenge that you've seen when you see organizations implementing or developing D&I programs, and how do you think that can be addressed?
I think the biggest challenge to an inclusion program is unconscious bias or preconceived notions, or what's referred to sometimes as stereotype threats. All of these three things, or it's really one thing, it's really one big elephant in the room, because it affects the way we behave towards people and the way we think about other people. And we all have them. Everybody has biases. We get them from childhood. We first learn them in our homes, and then as we move out into schools, we learn more. But these biases, as I said before, affect how we relate to other people. So to address these biases is it's a little difficult in that it involves people, and you don't want to be confrontational when you suspect or see bias in one form or the other, even if it's coming from yourself. But you just want to become aware of it. I'd like to give an example. In 2014, in one of his last press conference of the year, President Obama made a decision to call only on women reporters. Now, typically in those press conferences, the front rows are lined with the male reporters. He completely overlooked them and called on women. So one way that organizations can address the unconscious bias is to call on or allow underrepresented or marginalized members of these groups to speak up so that their peers can hear them, can hear from them, and they can begin to see that, oh, they may not look like I think they ought to look, or they don't, they don't wear, or they don't go to the same church I go to, but hey, they know this work, they know what they're doing, and then we're all here to achieve a common goal. So let's get this, let's do this. Let's do this. So not to go on and on and on, that's what I believe is the biggest challenge.
Thank you for that, Theresa. Dr. Davis, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with Theresa. The biggest challenge that I have seen across the more than 2 decades that I've done this work is the behavior change. Organizational leaders erroneously think that they can just implement programs without addressing that behavior change that's necessary, right? And that comes directly from unconscious bias. But you can't have one without the other. And so there's a behavior change that's necessary to successfully execute on D&I programs. So training is an option, but it is only a small part of it. And so instead, the more effective ways of addressing behavior is to first identify the biases that we as individuals have. And to Theresa's point, all have them. It doesn't mean we're sick. It doesn't mean there's a blame and shame game. It just means that if we have a brain, we have bias. But each of us can identify what our biases are. And there are numerous tools that are in the marketplace that are free that we can use. One is the association test that is sponsored by Harvard. It takes a couple minutes. It's free. It identifies biases related to function, gender, skin color, you name it. It's broken down into various categories. But once an individual has the information related to identifying those biases, then the next step would be to map out where on the diversity continuum your leadership team sits. So let's picture the leadership team of an organization. Each leader has the onus to identify their individual biases. You pull a group report together and map out where your leadership team sits. Is it in denial all the way on the left-hand side, or is it in adaptation all the way on the right? Or is it somewhere in the middle? And once you determine where you sit on that continuum, then you can work to build bridges to close the gaps to get to the next stage and the next stage, so that you are in a place where you can truly maximize your curiosity. And then you get these bite-sized learning pieces that support that learning journey. It's a journey, but you cannot have a program without addressing that behavior change.
No, I completely agree. And just to pick both of your brains on something, talking about behavior, one of the questions that was submitted before the talk was about engagement. And so, how do we make sure that, people see this as a joint effort for everyone, that they're engaged and committed to doing what an organization is putting forward, where it seems like people are either not as vocal, or they're like, this is not my issue. Any thoughts?
Well, I think that leaders should encourage all of the team members to make comments or to participate in discussions, because that's the only way to make progress. And I know that there are cases where you have a team, and on that team you may have 1 or 2 people who are very vocal. They always have things to say, have so much input. And that's great. That's just great. But in those types of situations, if the leaders or managers would put into place something like a no interruption rule, so that when one person is speaking, let them share their perspective, and let's listen. Let's give them let's respect their opinion. And even, I've heard of some organizations having a member when there's a meeting, having a member who has a timer. So then when people start sharing, they give them a certain amount of time to share. And when time's up, they on the timer. But that gives the whole team an opportunity to share. And back when I said providing a supportive atmosphere, if that supportive atmosphere is in place, then the employees should have reached a place where they feel comfortable to share when given the opportunity. And again, there's another way to address some of these biases is bystander intervention. If you're standing or you're listening or you're aware of something that's going on and you feel that it's unfair, intervene. And I don't mean physically, and I don't mean being rude or creating an argument or anything. Just gently, if you can, intervene so that everyone feels welcome to participate, to give their perspective, to give their ideas, because that's what leads to innovation. That's what leads to progress. That's what leads to achieving these goals.
Yeah, I agree with Theresa, and I'd like to add the best engagement tool that I have seen to kick off or jumpstart diversity and inclusion on a large scale is an employee town hall or an all hands meeting of some sort. And you can use that time, or leaders can use that time to do experiential learning. Show a video followed by a discussion, play icebreaker type games where everyone plays a role. Whatever you do, it should be an opportunity for everyone to get involved. And once you get the momentum started, you have to keep the work to keep it, because the key is, once you start it, is to maintain sustainability, right? And it's got to remain sustainable regardless how often leaders change out of those roles. And ways to make it sustainable is clearly lay out the behaviors that you want everyone, not just leaders, you want everyone to model. Yes, leaders must show the example so that others follow. But if you map out the behaviors and invite your employees to hold you accountable, then you can use, I know many organizations have like intranets. You can post a picture or, include a chat of some sort, get a chat going, and you can call it an inclusion moment. And Theresa's a storyteller, and you can tell a story around how you sat in a meeting and, leader X demonstrated inclusion by doing Y. Post a picture, get that going, get that culture of accountability going. So it's a call in culture, instead of a calling out culture. And I think those are some really great engagement tools that I have seen be effective.
That's wonderful. Yes, thank you. Thank you both. This is, really trying to galvanize and making sure that this is a continuous effort versus a one and done, and I'm going to forget about it type of program. So thank you both. Let's go ahead and switch into the next slide and talk about our next topic, which is mentoring. And mentoring is a very near and dear subject to my heart. Because I have been, richly rewarded through mentoring programs before coming to IBM and during my time at IBM. I treasure all of my mentors, not so much from the standpoint of skills transfer, but feeling like I belonged and, feeling like my worth was valued within the organization. And many companies like Johnson & Johnson and Coca-Cola have utilized these types of programs to not only create more inclusive cultures, but to help with promotion to senior management or executive level. So, Dr. Davis, what extent do you think mentoring, whether it's formal or informal, can be helpful as part of a D&I program?
Yeah, Susanne, mentoring programs are so incredibly helpful. But I also think if organizations have mentoring programs, they should also have sponsorship programs. And let me tell you why I say this. When we look in the marketplace, oftentimes people of color don't saturate the leadership levels. And instead, we see a lot of white men and women. So over time, what has happened is the behavior that is typically attributed to leaders is defaulted to the behavior of a white male. Right or wrong, it just is. So then what happens is, because people of color don't demonstrate leadership like a white male, it is assumed they need a mentor, when actually what they may need is a sponsor. That's the first thing. But now, if mentoring is in place, formal or informal, I think there should be a framework that's outlined. First, it's best to outline the qualities of a successful mentor, because let's face it, not all leaders make good mentors. And that is an assumption that just because you're a leader, it means, you'll make a good mentor, but that's not necessarily the case. Second, be thoughtful and intentional in the way that pairs are assigned in that mentoring relationship to ensure that both mentor and mentee are open to learning from one another. Oftentimes what we see is the mentor thinking, I don't have anything to learn from this person because they're junior to me. But that's the wrong way of thinking. So both the mentor and mentee should be open to learning from another. Third, ask each pair to create guiding principles, like how often they plan to meet, how long will the discussion last. This ensures ownership of the relationship being in both camps, with the mentor and the mentee. Finally, it's important that the pair set up no more than 2 goals to work toward. And I think those pieces, those 4 pieces, give purpose to that relationship, formal or informal.
I couldn't agree more. I can't disagree with anything that you just said. So thank you, Theresa. Any thoughts?
Well, when it comes to mentorship, I think it is very effective if it's done correctly, or if it's done in a forward moving way. Mentorship works for leaders as well as the members of teams and lower level management. Mentoring for leaders can come through leaders of other organizations who've been successful with inclusion programs. They can share what it is they've done. How did they achieve a successful program? Mentoring among employees, if the mentors are trained, because mentorship is really a skill, you have to look at it as a form of service. You're trying to help another individual. Once a mentor has been assigned a mentee, then that mentoring time should be established and protected, so that, for example, a team leader or manager doesn't call a meeting during a time when a mentor and a mentee are supposed to be having their time together. Another thing that helps with mentorship is creating accountability, making sure that the mentor and the mentee, actually spend time together. I've been in situations where I was assigned a mentor and I never heard from them. I would have to make the first move. Hi, they tell me you're my mentor. What are we going to do? So create accountability, and then focus on building trust, because people need to be able to trust as a mentor. Your mentee needs to feel that they can trust you. And by the same token, a mentor needs to be able to trust the mentee. So establish or build trust with each other, and then measure your results. Spend time together, and then down the line, look and see if any progress has been made. And if not, maybe you want to look at assigning a new mentor. And the same thing goes with leaders. Once you've found someone or come in contact with someone who's had a successful inclusion program, stay in contact with that person. Let them know how your program is progressing. Maybe you run into some problems. Maybe you get discouraged, because I heard someone say that a lot of people start these programs and then they just, give up. And it's easy to give up because you're dealing with so many different diamonds with all these personalities. But if you're consistent and you stick with it, research shows that inclusion works.
No, that's fabulous advice. Thank you so much. let's go ahead and move to the next slide and section. And, talking about the fact that, for small and mid-sized organizations and, making sure that they have the resources to put a D&I initiative together. As I mentioned earlier, about $1 million on average is spent in creating these types of programs. And, unfortunately, these organizations may not have the people or the resources to do it. But we all know that there needs to be a significant investment to do this successfully. So for these organizations, Theresa, what resources or advice would you offer to them?
The advice I'd offer them is to remember that it doesn't cost anything to be courteous and kind to one another. It doesn't cost anything for a small business to actually clearly define their goals and then align the contributions of each employee toward achieving those goals. That doesn't cost anything. Nor does it cost anything to actually assess what's happening with the employees that you have. Are they working well together? Are they able to, talk to each other? And if not, start the conversation. That doesn't cost a thing. Just come in one morning and tell a story about the night you had before, or the weekend you're looking forward to, and pull these people into the conversation. Then you begin to get to understand who it is you're working with. And as you understand them, you make a connection. And connections lead to more inclusive behavior, because once you can connect to people and find that you have things in common, you can establish a level of trust there. And so you start to feel comfortable talking with people and sharing your perspectives and your ideas. And then you can form throughout that organization, which doesn't cost a penny, you form a shared belief that everyone in the workspace is valuable and respected, and that their input and ideas are needed, and then work toward achieving your goals.
No, I couldn't agree more. It's funny that people think that grand and elaborate gestures are needed to kind of start these things, and it really is the small but meaningful and impactful things that you can do in the course of your day and the course of your time that really make a difference. Dr. Davis, was there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I like everything that Theresa said, but I also wanted to add to that metrics. We all know that what gets measured gets done, right? And regardless whether you have, a ton of dollars to throw at the effort, it doesn't matter. But metrics is so incredibly important. So in terms of metrics, it's important to capture representation data at all levels of the organization in a manner that means something. And once you have that overall representation information, look a little deeper and capture how long it takes employees to move, whether it's upward mobility or lateral mobility, but capture how long it takes for employees to move in the organization, and then look to see if the timeline is the same for people of color versus non-minorities. And typically what we'll see is that it takes twice as long for people of color to move up in the organization. Also look at your succession planning data and promotion data. Those metrics usually give you a pretty clear look as to how people of color are showing up, and women, how they're showing up in the company. And I think without metrics, it is very hard to determine where your needs lie, gaps you may have, and what programs you would need. So I think that's the most important piece of advice I feel like I would give to a small or mid-sized organization is capture your metrics so that you will know what needs to be done next.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. And, that is actually a perfect segue into our last section in question, which is talking about measuring outcomes and accountability. So, thinking about that and taking that a step further, can you call out some of the metrics that you said some of them, but are the any additional metrics that organizations should be focusing on. And to that end, when things aren't going well, how do we make sure that we're holding people accountable to fix that so that they can be successful?
Absolutely. Suzanne, so when it comes to recruiting, right, leaders think that hiring fixes everything. Well, that's not the case. Because if your culture is not inclusive, then you can hire until the cows come home, but people will leave. And I've worked with clients where their employees leave faster than they can bring them in. So when we're talking about like recruiting metrics, for example, my recommendation would be to look at the entire recruiting process and all metrics across that process. Look at how your applicants come in the door. So, do you have minorities and non-minorities applying at the same rate? If you do, great. And then look to see how both communities move across that process from the time they apply to the time they get their phone screen with your recruiter to the time they get to a hiring manager, a panel interview, and an offer stage. And that recruiting process will tell you if your minorities and women are falling out of the process and where they're falling out of the process. And then you can dig a little deeper based on what that data tells you. So that's one example of recruiting data. In terms of development and retention data, you could take a look at the programs that you have, who's participating, what criteria you have to bring in participants, and then what happens after that program is leveraged. Is there lateral or upward mobility as a result of networking that occurs in that development program? Exit interview data, you capture that. Look at who's leaving faster, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, and that can also tell you a story. But it's important, so many companies gather exit interview data, but they don't do anything with it. In terms of accountability, though, there are different ways that can be done if none of the above is working, right? So first, you can tie it to a leader's bonus or paycheck. And it's easy to think if it's done this way, that a lot of check the box behavior could occur. So what you could do is to mitigate that check the box behavior is you give a leader a part of the bonus or a percentage of that amount when a diverse candidate or female candidate is hired. And then you can give the second half or second portion of it. It could be doled out if that employee reaches a certain tenure. And as an organization, you can decide what that tenure could be. It could be a year, it could be 3 years, whatever the case may be. But this holds that leader accountable to not just bringing in diverse talent, but developing and retaining them. And I think that's what presents the check the box behavior. And that's what I've seen work across my career.
Great. Theresa, did you have any thoughts?
Well, she covered everything so well. And I certainly agree that holding leaders accountable is key to ensure that everyone is treated fairly. I like the idea of looking, dangling their bonuses in front of them to encourage fair treatment. But then on the other hand, you can also say, look, if we can't do this, perhaps I need to find another person to replace you in your position because this is important to me. We as a company or an organization have made the decision to create or foster an inclusive climate, and I need help from every person in this organization. And if you can't do your role, we've clearly defined what we want here, what we need here in order to create this inclusion, then I'll just find someone else.
Too funny.
That may sound a little harsh, but I mean, down on the lower level, if you're an employee and you're not doing your job, that's what they hear. Look, you can't do it. We'll find somebody who will. So that's my thought. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Theresa. That's straight to the point. Ladies, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Sarah now, who's going to assist us with the Q&A. And everyone who's stayed on, thank you so much. We really look forward to answering your questions.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. That was an absolutely amazing discussion. We do have quite a few questions that have come into the Q&A, so we're going to try to get through as many as we can before the end of this session. Anything that we don't get through, we're going to do our best to address offline and be able to post the responses. So first up, because personally this question struck me, and I think it's something that affects not only people of color within tech, but also specific to women in tech. What are your thoughts on having older Caucasian men leading D&I programs in large corporations?
So I'm happy to jump in on that one. That's a great question. And it's interesting because leaders tend to think just because you are a person of color, woman of color, male of color, whatever the case may be, that you should be able to run a D&I program successfully. Here's the thing. For me personally, and I've done this work for such a long time, I have seen it led by both. I've seen it led by a white male versus a person of color. The challenge with people of color always leading the charge is, even though you may have a seat at that C-suite level, when you're advocating for people who look like you, sometimes it can sound like noise. So if you have a person of color leading the charge, you also need that allyship. And Susanne talked about allyship earlier. You must be able to have D&I champions who don't look like you to help carry that message. I think if a white male is leading the charge, that person has got to surround themselves with people of color who can help advise. And that person has got to be open to guidance from someone who's not like them. And so it doesn't matter which side of the house, but the person of color has to make sure that they have allyship around them. And the white male has to make sure that he surrounds himself with a core trusted team of advisors who are people of color.
Dr. Davis, I completely agree to you. Just to, kind of piggyback, some people listen to certain messages from certain people. It's the messenger. And sometimes that person has access to certain places, to certain people that unfortunately people of color or other groups may not have. And so we need diverse people in diversity and inclusion, whether it be white male or otherwise, kind of leading this charge. And taking that a step further, this is an effort that we have to do together. It really can't be the burden of one group saying that this is what has to happen. It's got to be a concerted effort from all of us.
Agreed.
And I'd just like to add, when you're appointing a diversity and inclusion leader, it's important to have a conversation with them and listen carefully. And what you're listening for is that likability penalty. Because people, in talking to you when they're comfortable, will share, for example, whether they prefer one group over another group, or whether they have a belief that one group is totally incompetent in performing certain duties, or that you have to really put in effort with certain groups of people because they're just not like us. They're just not going to be able to grasp these. And when you have these conversations before appointing someone, you won't make the mistake of appointing a person who's going to be skewed toward one group rather than the whole, everyone, whether they're going to treat someone fairly. And so then it won't matter whether it's an older white male. If you've had that conversation and you hear and can determine that this older white male is in line with your idea and your desire to create an inclusive program, then that should work. But always, no matter who's in charge of diversity and inclusion, like someone said, they need support. They need other people to help them along the way because, different perspectives help.
Those are all really great points. Sort of next up, what How do you respond when someone talking about the talent pool and someone is saying that the talent pool just doesn't have a diverse population for them to hire from? They don't have anybody to look at. What are your responses to that?
It's an excuse.
Yep.
Plain and simple. It's an excuse. I mean, let's call it what it is, right? And I've heard, if I had a nickel for every time I heard that particular phrase come out of hiring manager's mouth or a leader's mouth, I would be a billionaire. But it's an excuse. You can say that the same way as saying there's no diverse talent out there. There are just no women in tech. Well, no. Then you're either looking at the wrong places, right? 2, you are just not surrounding yourself with people who can point you in the right direction. And 3, you may need to dig a little deeper in your pocket to pay those people. Because in my mind, it is an excuse. Our marketplace is saturated with women and minorities who are more than capable of doing the job that we need them to do. Let's go find them. Stop making excuses.
Yeah, Dr. Davis, I agree. I think a lot about the advice that I'm usually given at, in work. Like if you have a problem, rather than going to your boss and telling them that you have a problem, start thinking about solutions. And I feel like if you really are saying that there's no candidate pool that you can be pulling from, or it's not, they don't have the skill level, I challenge you then to think about being a little bit more creative about your solutions. So there are plenty of academic institutions and nonprofits that would kill to have your insights in developing these programs so that when people are done, they can be gainfully employed. Like, why not talk with them? Why not start that dialogue? I think it really is incumbent on businesses to really expand your pie and think outside the box about what talent pools should look like and where they come from. And if you're serious about diversity and inclusion, you'll do the work.
Yep.
Anything to add, Theresa?
I concur.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so we're gonna call it on the Q&A right there. We still have several really compelling questions that we would have loved to get to, but time's just not in our favor. But like I said, we're going to address these offline and we'll publish those responses out. I would like to thank you so much to Susanne, Dr. Davis, and Theresa for all of your time today. I am sure I speak for everyone here when I say that your words have given us all incredible inspiration that we can take back to our own companies and try to affect that change. I continually come back to the idea and the quote that, diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being invited to dance, and let's just get everybody out on the dance floor. So thank you guys so much. For everyone who joined us today, we do have some exciting news for you. Susanne has graciously donated 100 copies of her book, Women of Color in Tech, for those of us who have attended. And WTF, because we want everybody to be able to get this, will be covering the costs for a copy for everybody beyond that 100 initial attendees. So, and then in addition to that, WTF will be making a donation of $3,000 to an initiative of Susanne's choice. So thank you everyone absolutely. Thank you everyone for sticking with us on this sort of crazy ride through COVID. And don't forget that our next masterclass is coming up Tuesday of next week, July 21st at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. It's sponsored by Google, and Candace C. will walk us through empowering the female investor. And as always, we want to thank our 2020 sponsors. And without you guys, events like this would not be possible. So thank you all. We hope you have a great rest of your day and you stay safe and happy and healthy through these very weird and difficult times.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.